Good morning, everyone. I'm Anneke Van Woudenberg. I'm the Executive Director of a corporate watchdog NGO called RAID. We do lots of work to document wrongdoing by multinational companies operating in Africa and then trying to hold them to account. Never an easy task, but one of my great pleasures while doing that work has been to get to know Tom Burgis, who seems to be, I suppose, a kind of traveler on this journey with many of us who do this kind of work. So it's a real pleasure to get to chat with him this morning in front of all of you. And it also meant I get to go back and have a look at your biography, which I'd kind of forgotten all the things he did before I got to know him. So let me first do a proper introduction of Tom, because he comes with lots of pretty amazing things.
Lots of baggage, I thought you were about to say.
No, never, definitely not baggage. There's some fun facts I learned. But first of all, for those of you who don't know, his latest book, Kleptopia, How Dirty Money is Conquering the World, published in 2020, has become an international bestseller, and we're going to be talking a bit more about that today. If you haven't read it yet, definitely pick up a copy. Tom once had his sights on being a wandering poet. Who knew? Lucky for us, I think. He changed course, took up journalism,
Wasn't good enough.
served as a foreign correspondent in South America and Africa. We'll have him do some poetry for us afterwards.
Yeah, sure.
He then spent 16 years at the Financial Times, including as a member of its investigation team. Earlier this year, he jumped to The Guardian, where he's now an investigations correspondent. His journalism has won awards in the US and the UK and Asia. Perhaps most important for us today is Tom was slapped in 2020 here in the UK, not once, but twice. We'll talk a bit more about that, but please join me in welcoming Tom Burgis.
Thank you very much.
We won't have you start with a poem, but we'll maybe end with that if we need to. I think we do need a poem on SLAPPs if we can get one. Let's start at the beginning. So you were slapped in 2020 for your book Kleptopia and reporting on the Financial Times. What happened? How did it start? Did a letter arrive through the letterbox?
Well, it started many years earlier in Africa when I was covering Congo and the endless woe and strife and poverty and war that accompanies, as you have, and RAID have documented so brilliantly, that accompanies those huge natural riches. And I started to take an interest in the multinational companies that profit from those riches and operate under that the Congolese political regime. And one of them is called ENRC. So for those who don't know, ENRC is an enormous mining company, one of the biggest in the world. And it mines a lot of stuff out of the ground in Congo. I kept an eye on them over the years. They're owned by 3 oligarchs from the former Soviet Union. And when I came to write a book about how dirty money is conquering the world, this was one of the multinationals I looked at, because their origins were in Kazakhstan, raging kleptocracy from the former Soviet Union. And their most profitable mines were in Congo, a raging kleptocracy in the heart of Africa. So they seemed an interesting example of how global business is forming these networks that connect the parts of the world where corruption and its consequences are worst. And in the course of reporting this book, I looked at what I would say is, or was, the most important criminal corruption investigation in the UK, which was the Serious Fraud Office's investigation into ENRC. It was a UK investigation because ENRC used to be one of the biggest companies on the UK Stock Exchange, one of the most valuable companies registered in Britain. One of the strange things that happened with this investigation was that several of the potential witnesses, if it was ever one day going to come to court, kept dying in suspicious circumstances. Now, this is when, as journalists, we start to consider the public interest. what do we do each day when we get up? What do we choose to concentrate on? What should we publish? What's right to publish? What do people have a right to know about? What's important for free societies that people know about? And potential witnesses in major criminal cases seems to me pretty high up the league of public interest. So in Kleptopia and in an accompanying magazine story in the Financial Times, which is where I was working at the time, I wrote about these people who had died. One in South Africa and two fellow South Africans who died in the US. And I looked into the circumstances of their deaths and all the suspicious circumstances of those deaths, and pointed out that they were potential witnesses in a UK corruption case. I made it very clear that we didn't know what had happened we didn't know for sure what had happened to these men in their last moments. And we certainly didn't know if they had been murdered, who murdered them. But it was very important to draw attention to these deaths. ENRC and the oligarchs behind it didn't like Kleptopia. I don't know what they thought about its literary merits. Got mainly good reviews. I think it was more to do with the fact that they were centrally described in it. Before the book came out, we did the usual thing of a right of reply process, contacting everybody who's in it, listing the points we propose to make about them and saying, are any of these wrong? It's when it's done right, it's just a good faith exercise in reporting. It's like, this is what I think I know about you, Anneke, and your global web of corruption. Is any of this wrong? And maybe you'll lie to me, and maybe I'll be able to figure out that that's lies. Maybe you will correct me on some things that are genuinely wrong. Maybe it will be a mix of the two. But it's all part of good faith reporting. As it happens with Kleptopia, the legal to and fro before it was published ran to twice the length of the book, about 600 pages of often quite threatening correspondence, including one letter from Africa threatening me with jail.
Pleasant.
Anyway, after the book came out and the FT magazine story came out, we had nothing for a little while. And then I got a message from someone who keeps a close eye on legal filings all around the world, popping up in all sorts of courts around the world, and said, do you know there's a filing in New York court about your book? And I didn't know, because it had been filed ex parte. It had been filed without notifying the subject. And this was the beginning of the SLAPP against me and the book and my publishers and my newspaper. And it began with an attempt in US court to force the publishers of the American edition to hand over anything that might indicate who the sources of the book were. So an immediate, direct attempt to violate the most sacred trust in journalism, which is that between the reporter and the source. And let's remind ourselves, in a story that's about people dying in suspicious circumstances, so you can imagine the sources were absolutely terrified of being identified. I should stress that at no stage does anybody say who committed these murders. It's about, if murders they were, it's about drawing attention to suspicious deaths of witnesses, a really important topic.
And just in this case, Tom, was it the oligarchs who took the action, or was it the company? And say a bit why you think they began in the US.
I still don't quite understand why they began in the US, but throughout the entity that is bringing these suits is not a human being. It's not even the corporation itself on paper. It's a holding company based in London. And what the lawyers, Boyce Schiller in the US, and then centrally Taylor Wessing in London, eventually articulate is that they claim that I wrote that this holding company, just a figment of a corporate imagination, right? Holding company is not a real thing. That this holding company, ENRC Limited, murdered 3 people and poisoned a 4th, actually, who didn't die. Now, my daughter, who is bright, but at the time was only 5, I think could probably explain to you that was absolute bullshit. and that I would have had a word about her language, but you know, I would have commended the sentiment that the holding companies can't murder people, and this is what you see again and again with SLAPPs. I'm sure there'll be other examples today, and I'm sure there were yesterday. That the legal premise, the central argument that a court is being asked to deal with is nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. And yet, millions of pounds are at stake. Years of people's lives are swallowed. In my case, I was put under surveillance. I had to completely transform the way I deal with sources. It's a huge strain on my family and my professional life. All for a bullshit claim that a figment of a corporate imagination can go around murdering people. And the purpose, as far as I was able to divine, of what was happening was simply to try to punish someone who had had the temerity to write about some rich people who didn't want to be scrutinized.
Now, one of the things that was interesting about your case, there are many interesting things about this particular case, but you were one of 18 legal claims that the company had going at one particular point in time, both in the US and in the UK, against journalists, against whistleblowers, against their own lawyers, against the Serious Fraud Office, etc.
Against the state,
against the state itself. You were one of the rare ones that won.
Too rare.
Yes. And I was in court that day when the kind of judge found that this was not a decent libel claim and was going to be thrown out. But tell me a little bit about why you think, in this particular case, you were successful.
Well, the thing about these cases is, I mean, I'm not that bad. I have no personal ill feeling towards these oligarchs. I'm not particularly bothered about this company, what it does, how it fares. I'm concerned with what it does, I suppose. What's so striking about this is the process, is the ability of anyone. It could be NRC and these oligarchs, could be anyone, could be a rich guy in this part of London. Simply the ability to essentially to choose to exempt yourself from the public record. And when I say there have been too few victories, I mean that sort of generally, in that, by and large, cases like mine are the exception. Now, I think it's about 2 years since you and I met by London Bridge and had lunch. And since when, you've done absolutely astonishing work, I would say. Because no one then was talking about this. No one even really knew the term. I'm not sure there even was a term, or if there was, it was very obscure. There was, but no one.
Just you didn't know it yet. You hadn't been slapped yet, Tom.
No one knew it. No, this is at the beginning of the SLAPP, and since then we've had this enormous change in the awareness of what's going on. But it remains the case that cases like mine or Catherine Belton's over that amazing book, Putin's People. It remains the case that these are the exceptions, and by and large, if you want to slap someone into silence, you can. Sadly, that's still the case. That is unchanged. I mean, I was doing the legal review yesterday on my next book, which is coming out in February, which touches on some of this stuff. And the conclusion is that for all the attention and all this extraordinary campaigning and the parliamentarians who've got behind it, essentially, you can silence the press or anyone you like through the UK courts to this day. And the reason we won, I think, was for a combination of factors. One was, like Catherine Belton, I was published by HarperCollins, which is a wealthy, well-resourced, aggressive, courageous publisher, and represented by Arabella Pike, who is extraordinarily courageous publisher and editor in support of her authors. The FT stood firm too, and I think an element of it was that certain judges have started to realise that they don't want their courts to be abused in this way. But it remains the case that generally, SLAPPs, we never hear about them, right? They're like super injunctions. The ones that work well, you never hear about. You never read the story. None of it ever appears. There's a vast iceberg beneath the surface. And partly also I just sort of intersected with world events quite a lot. So the hearing at which we won, the first hearing in the case, was supposed to be in early February 2022, and a defamation case. And this was a preliminary hearing. But the ENRC barrister was taken ill, so we delayed by a month. And by the time we came back to court, Putin had invaded Ukraine. So what was quite an obscure case was suddenly an extremely interesting case, because here are oligarchs from the former Soviet Union trying to silence, trying to ban a book about dirty money and Putin and so on. And the significance of that, I think, was obviously a lot clearer to a lot more people because of the invasion. But as I say, unfortunately, the momentum that's been built, though it's resulted in some excellent things, and we'll see hopefully next year the rules from the Economic Crime Act anti-SLAPP provision take shape and take force. After an initial very successful skirmish, there's still a long war to be fought, I think.
Yeah. One thing I just want to mention, because I think it was particularly interesting in your case as well, you had an incredibly well-informed judge, it seemed. And there was a particular moment in the case, and maybe we should just talk about that, where the judge absolutely saw through this issue of the holding company and the cardboard cutout analogy that he used. Maybe we just want to mention that for a moment, because it was, we don't always get great judges in these cases, or not necessarily judges that are well-informed or fully understand the context. You got a good one.
Yeah.
Maybe just talk a bit about how he saw through the holding company issue.
Yeah, I thought, but Matthew Nicklin was the judge. I thought, the senior judge on defamation cases in the High Court. Well, I mean, I must say, we'd put together a fantastic case. Wiggin and the barristers did an extraordinary job. Almost making it quite enjoyable, bizarrely. And everyone had kept their spirits up and so on for all the extraordinary smears and surveillance and all the rest of it that was going on. But yes, absolutely, Matthew Nicklin, I think, clearly didn't want his courts used in this way. And there was a great moment. One of the moments when it's great when you're sitting there, and there's a moment when your own legal team, who I imagine there are quite a few lawyers in the room, will never express confidence in anything. But there's a moment when they just look at you and go, and you started to feel, okay, maybe this is going away. Anyway, I got one of those when Matthew Nicklin, Mr. Justice Nicklin, was grappling with this point of like how absurd it is to suggest that a holding company could murder someone. And he said, well, if you are walking along holding a gun, but you're carrying a cardboard cutout in front of you, you reach around the side and shoot someone, it's not the cardboard cutout that shot someone. It's the person behind. And it was around that time that my publisher, that Arabella Pike, started punching me in the leg. And anyway, the case was thrown out that day. Yeah. But it's true that I think in my case and in other cases, we've seen Mr. Justice Nicklin really get to grips with this use of the court and start to use case management powers in interesting ways to address proportionality and so on, without having a statute or new procedure rules yet to inform that. I think that's been very interesting. I think one of the subtler ways that things have changed is in how the judges see these things, although it's obviously hard to read. But yeah, there are lots of judges, and it's also the case that, as with other things like unexplained wealth orders and so on, often a judge is being asked, essentially because of globalization, to wrestle with extraordinarily detailed assessments of Kazakh politics, for instance, or the Congolese elections, or whatever it may be. Russian money laundering, and I don't think it's reasonable to expect a judge to be able to have the same level of expert knowledge as as an oligarch or a reporter or whoever it may be. And that's just a broader problem with the intersection of a global economy and national courts, isn't it?
And I want to move on to what this means for investigative journalism, but I think it is just worth pointing out, I mentioned there were 18 other cases at one particular point in time, and of course
This is ENRC's other cases.
ENRC's other cases. A number of those are still proceeding through the courts, so you managed to win one, and that's phenomenal, but there continues to be a range of other individuals targeted by the same company.
It's true. Also, I just take issue with the win. I mean, it does feel like a win on the day, but all you're trying to do is just get back to being able to do your job. Yeah. You're just trying to get back to zero.
And let's talk about that for a moment, actually, because that's also, I think, important. What was the impact on your journalism, and what do you think was the impact on other investigative journalists covering the same company or similar issues?
Right, so I think the best example of this is Catherine Belton, who's an old friend of mine, and I'm sure everyone will know she wrote Putin's People. We used to work together at the Financial Times. She was in Russia when I was in Africa. Fellow Northerners occasionally meet for a pie and a pint, and we had the same publisher brought out our books. Now in the months leading up to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, I'd say Catherine Belton is one of the most valuable journalists on the planet for understanding what's happening. It's hard to think of a more important topic to be covering, and it's hard to think of a more important time to have our absolute best journalists doing their work on it. A brilliant Russian speaker, fabulous connections, courageous, has stood up to Putin for years. She's taken off the field by a concerted attack on her. Again, farcical. In the case of the case that Carter Ruck brought for Rosneft, a complaint that was based on a kind of business raid that had been reported thousands, I believe it is thousands of times before. Complete abuse of the courts. And the real life consequence of that, apart from the personal strain on Catherine, who, incredibly courageously stood up to it all, is that we don't get to have her doing the reporting that she should be doing. We don't get the benefit of that scrutiny of Putin and his international network of influence and his inner circle and so on. I think that's the best example. I mean, I had a shit time too, but I mean, I think for me that's the best. And I can talk about what happened to me a bit if you want, but I think that the Belton example is really striking.
Yeah, but also, was it also the same for you? So kind of, are you spending 50% less of your time doing reporting, or even none at all when you're facing this?
So Catherine had 4 cases, and I had kind of 2, but it was essentially 1. It was sort of the same material, really. So I was able to keep reporting. I was also on paternity leave, and the courts don't stop for that. So I was in court when I should have been with my baby. But so there's the personal aspect of it. It's hard for children. I don't want to get too much into this, but it's obviously hard for children. Children don't understand about civil procedure. If daddy's going off to court, they think you might be going to jail. Yeah. That's very hard. Yeah. And but again, the more important point, I think, is twofold. One's about sources, and one's about making sort of targeting journalists and knocking them off the field. So sources, once this is the thing I will never know, because you never know who doesn't end up approaching you. But once there are filings in open court in the US saying, I'd like to assume that everyone understands this is a smear and without evidence, but saying that I was being paid off by mysterious unnamed enemies of the oligarchs to write all this, where I'm corrupt. That's an open filing. It just sits there. Once it's known that I'm someone who's been targeted by oligarchs trying to use legal processes to expose sources, even though they weren't ultimately exposed, once it's known that I'm expensive, that people have insurance, but you have to pay huge excesses on these cases, that does make it harder. Once we found out that I was under surveillance, so through one of these other legal cases, it was revealed that when I went to meet another person who had scrutinised these oligarchs and their activities, I went to meet them in an underground car park in central London. Would never normally talk about meeting a source, but this is all now on the court record. And a few weeks later, he got a letter from some of ENRC's lawyers saying, "We think you've been committing the terrible offence of meeting a journalist." And we know we did this because we saw you in an underground car park under the National Theatre carrying a red, or was it perhaps orange, notebook. It's absolutely chilling detail that we were watching.
Yeah.
And so all of this means it's harder to work with sources, which is the whole job. Encouraging people who have access to important information to take the personal risk, way greater than we take, of entrusting journalists to report it. And the sort of professional strain of it, I just got back from the front in Ukraine, another part of my job. And I honestly find this stuff more difficult to grapple with because of that risk to sources. And the use of surveillance and these kind of ancillary techniques around the SLAPPs. So yeah, it does make things harder.
Did it also have an impact in the newsroom? So are your editors, do you think, you or other journalists who've been slapped, do you think they're looking at this differently? Are they thinking, gosh, you're a bit expensive, aren't you? You go around doing these corruption stories, that's going to take a bit of time. Maybe we won't do that one. Do you think it has an impact on decisions editors are making?
I think the way that works is primarily that it's the litigant that gets the reputation. So it's the oligarch. So let's imagine you, Anneke, as an oligarch for a moment, and you get a reputation. I know many people already think of you as an oligarch, but it's not fair.
It's definitely not fair.
It may be even defamatory.
Indeed.
But let's imagine that you have decided you just don't want people writing about that fortune you made in Russia before you became a pillar of society. And you sue people. Before that, you instruct Carter Ruck, Schillings, Taylor Wessing, whoever it may be, whenever any journalist sends in a request for comment, they get a ferocious legal letter threatening them with all kinds of professional and financial ruin. And maybe a couple of newspapers or broadcasters have the courage to go ahead and publish something on you. And well, in that case, they get absolute fire and brimstone. They get issued with a letter before claim. They get dragged to court and so on. Maybe you never win any of these cases. Maybe the judge throws them all out, but you still won, right? Because every editor in increasingly overstretched, underfunded newsrooms thinks, you've got a story about Anneke. That's going to be hard. That's going to be expensive. And anecdotally, you hear of particular names in particular newsrooms who are just off. We don't write about them. The reporter can go and do something else. Something against someone who isn't litigious. Ironically enough, a politician. So you can say anything you want about an elected politician, but if you dare to write something about the rich, you have these problems. And I would just one final point on that. Why I wrote my last book was because I think, having worked in the former Soviet Union and Africa, and increasingly seeing the influence of kleptocracy in UK politics, I think this is the most important story of our times, and I think there are other people far more intelligent, better qualified than me who agree. And you can see it manifesting itself in all sorts of ways, from political donations to the war in Ukraine. And this is exactly the territory that we need to concentrate our reporting firepower on now, for the good of our democracy and preserving it, and for the good of assisting those who are not lucky enough to live on democracies, who live in Russia, Ukraine, Congo, and so on, for trying to bring some scrutiny to their rulers that they're just prevented from doing themselves. This is exactly the area that SLAPPs are concentrated on. Right? It's redacting, censoring from the public record the most important material of our time, I think. That's part of the reason why it's so important. Absolutely, there are important SLAPPs that are related to domestic abuse, related to all sorts of other important topics. But this one is so vital, and it's exactly here that the public record is essentially just being censored.
I must say, just because I think that's such an important thing when we're talking about SLAPPs, is the impact it has on other reporting, not just your own reporting. And as a civil society activist who was watching what was happening with your case, but also then seeing the silence of the reporting on this particular company that had SLAPP Tom, there was just so little reporting happening on what was coming out in other court cases and what was happening on the ground and what was happening with a corruption investigation. And it was striking to see the silence that resulted. And it's, I suspect, and I hear from other journalists who were covering it, they were just saying, in the newsroom, it's become too difficult to cover the subject.
And again, it's not unique to them. It's just a principle, basically. It's a principle of good, honest journalism, is that no one's exempt from it.
Yeah.
You know, without fear or favour.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that's happened since you were slapped is there's been a legal change coming into effect soon, but on economic crimes. I mean, the irony is that wouldn't have helped you, right? It wouldn't have stopped the slap against you.
Yeah, well, so I assume we all know what we're talking about. You know, the provision in the Economic Crime Act it hasn't really been fleshed out yet, but that says that the committee that comes up with the rules for these things in civil procedures should draft. I'd be really interested to know if anyone knows exactly when this is supposed to happen, but we think maybe April the 1st. Well, should draft rules that make it harder to abuse the courts in this way. But because it was appended to the Economic Crime Act, it only covers economic crime. So, I mean, I think back to the SLAPP debate in Parliament, there was an incredibly moving speech about a SLAPP related to domestic violence, for instance. And yes, in my case, the subject matter was an alleged allegation of murder. So yeah, it wouldn't have helped. I mean, one of the things that slightly baffles me is that the MPs who have taken up this cause all say it's extraordinary to have this level of cross-party support for anything. Every party, major and minor, is against the courts being abused in this way by SLAPPs. And there was real momentum last year for primary legislation to stop SLAPPs, or to try to stop the courts being abused in this way. And there's all sorts of, Sue and her colleagues have come up with absolutely brilliant ideas, really well thought through, really persuasive, and done a great job of discussing them with parliaments. That seems to have run out of steam. No? Mm-hmm. Or hasn't materialised maybe as fast as we'd wanted.
Well, Susan hasn't run out of steam, so
Susan hasn't run out of steam at all.
We're definitely going to hear more about
I mean,
that. Yes.
Dominic Raab wasn't it, who was carrying the torch for that, and he's obviously not there anymore.
And I think
so no, I don't mean to suggest that it's not happening, but I suppose what I'm trying to say is that it's still very much needed. And I'd add an extra point. Actually, David Davis made this point in Parliament the other day, which is so important, that and a few of us have been saying this all along, really, that unless you change the financial incentives, it's hard to see how this fundamentally changes. So the kind of law firms that we've been making, the lawyers who work there, I'm sure are all perfectly decent human beings. They can make life-changing amounts of money abusing the courts and bringing these SLAPP cases. Absolutely enormous fees, because that's part of the weapon, right? You drum up, you ratchet up huge fees, and that's what's so forbidding. That's what makes so many people cave in the face of this. They're going to have to pay legal fees. There would be many, many, many multiples of the actual damages if you've get a bad judge, if you've somehow made a mistake, if you lose. And this was David Davis's point, and I think Chalk, the new Justice Secretary, seemed pretty keen on the idea, was to, as a beginning, try to address this question of the use of public money. So a SLAPP case that's brought in a court is very expensive to the public purse, which I think is an idea that actually hadn't been that discussed in this whole debate. But I mean, what's a judge a day? Thousands. The use of the court, ushers, and so on. Just there is a pretty significant cost to the taxpayer of having the courts used in this way for months and months and months and months, let alone the backlog in other cases with more merit that can't be heard. And I think there's also a broader question of whether the lawyers who bring cases that are found to be abusive should profit the way they do. I mean, there's no financial consequence for the law firms whatsoever. So what incentive do they have to stop bringing these cases?
I'm going to open it up to questions in a moment. So if you've got anything burning, please get ready to put your hand up. But before we do so, you're busy writing another book. And I'm curious whether in the back of your mind constantly, you're thinking about how to maneuver the book so you're not slapped again, or are you just now quite confident, okay, it may happen, but I can deal with this? How has this impacted your book writing?
Well,
and you can tell us about the new book coming out, because it's your chance to plug it.
No, I can't.
Okay, sorry.
But it's going to be announced in a few days.
Watch this space.
And yes, it is going to deal in part with questions about SLAPPs in the broader context of who gets to decide what's true and what's not. And yeah, we had the legal read yesterday, and no one threw themselves out of the window. And I suppose what's fascinating, it feels a little bit like, was it Louis Pasteur who took smallpox to sort of test his vaccine? feels slightly like being a sort of human guinea pig for some of this stuff. But I think what is so heartening about all of this, even though there's still a long way to go, is that here we all are discussing this, and we've all realised the importance of this. And I hope the book can make among other things, just a contribution to that, and really trying to get inside the mechanisms of how the defamation laws are used.
Can you tell us the title?
No.
No.
But
sitting on the edges of our seats.
It will be revealed in a few days.
Okay. Watch this space, everyone. Please, we get a couple of minutes for questions. So if you've got anything you want to ask Tom, now is your moment. We've got a couple of hands up, so we'll start over here.
Thanks very much. I was wondering if your move from the FT to the Guardian was related to the case, or if it was just a different separate decision.
Well, it's slightly more banal than that. I wanted to write this book, and I wanted to have some time with my children. However, writing books and raising children doesn't pay, for one thing. And also, I got talking to the Guardian's investigations editor, Paul Lewis, and they were doubling the size of their team. And they have done amazing work on these questions of kleptocracy and corruption and so on. And they wanted to get bigger and put a load of money behind it. And all my job offers have come in pubs that I've ended up taking. Anything I've applied for, I've never got. But so Paul and I got to talking, and he said, well, why didn't you join our team? And it's a fantastic team. I mean, I was in Ukraine for them recently, trying to see these connections between global corruption and proliferating wars. So that's what brought me to the Guardian, really.
And for any young journalist, you don't need to be in a pub to get a job. So just
no.
just highlighting that. No. We had a question here. No? Yes, one question there, and then the gentleman next to you. Please go ahead.
Thanks for that. I wondered, actually, this is also a question for you, Anneke, if you could talk a little bit about what ENRC have gone on to do since, and how, whether any of this has stopped it in its tracks, or any of the trio, or just how, what the postscript of this story is for them. Okay,
hold that thought for a moment. The postscript on ENRC, just the gentleman to the other side of the aisle.
Thanks, Tom. It's always interesting that, the threat against the SFO and this broader lack of watchdogs or regulators or investigations, and how they themselves can be targeted, and they themselves can then be forced back from their work, and whether you can say anything about that broader space. We've spoken about judges and lawyers, but there is that broader space where if there were robust police investigations, maybe it wouldn't require a journalist, or the journalist can help facilitate that, but also targeting them with legal action.
Well, the cops wouldn't know what to investigate. We didn't tell them.
Well, that's true, yeah. But like the targeting of them as well, and how that also extends the chilling, because you're not just chilling journalists, you're chilling state bodies, and how that dynamic works in SLAPPs. And
yes. Can I say something quickly about those two together? I mean, so the Serious Fraud Office dropped the case a few months ago, after 10 years, and they said they lack enough admissible evidence to proceed. Now, ENRC's position has always been that the serious fraud, this whole thing was cooked up by a dodgy lawyer who used to work for them, and the SFO made a string of errors, which they would say amounted to sort of, not amounted to, a string of errors, and also sort of conspired to cook up a case against them. And the SFO and the lawyer have been reprimanded by the court, especially the lawyer, who has been shown to behave pretty badly. There aren't a lot of heroes in this story, sadly. But it's also true that it has been extraordinary to watch how a public body has been so thoroughly attacked in the middle of a criminal case using civil cases. And just to give you a sense of the scale, the SFO's annual budget is $50–60 million a year.
Pounds.
Isn't it a little bit less in pounds? Well, so it works out about maybe $60–70 million a year. I once worked out that it would take the oligarchs, one of them's dead now actually, the trio of oligarchs who own ENRC, take them sort of 2 or 3 days to earn that. And we think they've spent something like $400 million, isn't it? Getting on for $500 million on this whole counterattack.
Litigation expenses. Yeah.
$500 million.
Yeah.
Or not exclusively, but the majority of it just happening in, we'll just step there in the High Court. And so I suppose the concern would be, the question to be asked here is, if you have enough money, and my God, that's a lot of money, can you just decide, I do not want to be subject to the law? And there isn't a definitive answer to that question from what we've seen here, but it certainly raises it troublingly.
And if I'll just add a little further bit to that postscript, the Serious Fraud Office investigated ENRC for 10 years. It became a rather iconic investigation, and an emblematic one in many ways, I would say. It was then dropped largely without any charges. I mean, one of the daughters of the oligarchs was charged in a separate case because she wouldn't reveal the father's diaries and other documents. Eventually she did. So that was, and she has got a small fine as a result, but it was largely a trajectory. It was a kind of offshoot of the case. And it does make, and the figures are startling, the amount of money used in this particular case by a company to, it appears, undermine the case, raise questions about the case. And there's no doubt the Serious Fraud Office had made some mistakes. But looking back at it now from a kind of bigger perspective, the Serious Fraud Office and state investigators look outgunned. They just don't have access to the same amount of funding and resources that their opponents do in these cases. And it weakens our state institutions to be able to hold those whom we're raising questions about in terms of corruption and bribery, holding them to account. And they're weakened as a result. And if I were a politician, I'd be deeply worried about this. As a member of the public, I'm deeply worried about the precedent set by this case, but also what it says about, in this country in particular, those law enforcement agencies who should be stepping up and taking the investigative journalism the next step, or highlighting these kinds of cases. It shouldn't just be journalists highlighting cases of bribery and corruption. So, and I should just say, as the other part of this, of course, a number of civil cases still continue, including against a former member of staff of the Serious Fraud Office and against the Serious Fraud Office itself. So, in effect, they have also been slapped. And that is still working its way through the courts. We are due to end, and I wanted to give you a final opportunity to tell us a poem or say something. Obviously, it's just amazing to have seen you come out the other end of this successful. And I know it's not a total success in the sense that this took a lot out of you, out of your reporting, has a huge impact on others. But what would you say now to other reporters who've been slapped? What are your final words of wisdom or advice?
I'm not sure what wisdom, or maybe even advice, but I think when you ask that question, what do I think? I think that the thing to remember in all of this is how ridiculous a lot of this is. And it can be very dark in the middle of these cases. But actually, a lot of the time, what you're dealing with is over wealthy bullies who don't like people telling them what reality is. And often it's quite funny if you can cling to that. And often it's quite absurd. It's quite sort of Emperor has no clothes-ish. And I think it's worth remembering this. Private Eye has been fighting these fights for a lot longer than a lot of the mainstream press, and they do it with a smile. And I think the reason that we can maybe see the sort of the comedy in some of this stuff is because Sue and others have been doing this extraordinary work, and it's been an extraordinary call to arms. But the war must go on.
Well, we're all looking forward to the unnamed book that's coming next. Thank you, Tom. Please join me in thanking Tom Burgis.
Cheers, thanks.
Thank you.